Thinking in quiet. Reclaiming depth in a world that won't stop talking. There is a moment just before dawn when the world holds its breath. The night sounds have faded, but the day has not yet begun its relentless chatter. In this brief window, something extraordinary happens. Your mind remembers what it feels like to be truly quiet. I discovered this moment by accident during a particularly difficult period in my life. Overwhelmed by decisions I couldn't seem to make and problems that felt impossibly tangled, I found myself waking earlier and earlier, not from anxiety, but from a strange pull toward the silence that lived in those pre-dawn hours. At first, I tried to fill even this quiet time, checking my phone, making mental lists, rehearsing conversations, but gradually I learned to simply sit with the stillness. What I found there changed everything. In that quiet, thoughts didn't race. They settled. Problems didn't multiply. They clarified. The urgent gave way to the important, and the complex revealed its simple core. I had stumbled upon something our ancestors knew intuitively, but that we, in our hyper-connected age, have nearly forgotten. That our deepest wisdom emerges not from the noise of constant input, but from the fertile silence of sustained attention. This book is an invitation to reclaim that silence, not as an escape from the world, but as a return to the kind of thinking that makes us most human. In a culture that has mistaken busyness for productivity and noise for engagement, we have lost touch with the profound intelligence that emerges when we give our minds permission to wonder, and to wait. The cost of this loss is higher than we imagine. When we cannot think deeply, we cannot choose wisely. When we cannot sit with uncertainty, we grasp at shallow solutions. When we cannot tolerate silence, we miss the quiet voice of intuition that often knows what our chattering minds cannot yet understand. But there is hope. The capacity for deep thought is not lost. It is merely buried beneath layers of distraction and hurry. Like a garden that has been neglected but not destroyed, it needs only the right conditions to flourish again. Those conditions are surprisingly simple: quiet, time, and the courage to trust that what emerges from stillness is worth more than what we produce in haste. Chapter 1: The Noise That Steals Our Thoughts. We live in the loudest era in human history, yet we rarely speak of the true cost of all this sound. I don't mean just the obvious noise, the traffic, the construction, the constant hum of machinery that forms the soundtrack of modern life. I mean the deeper noise, the kind that lives inside our heads and follows us everywhere we go. This internal noise has many sources. There are the notifications that train our brains to expect interruption every few minutes. There are the conversations we carry on with people who aren't present, rehearsing arguments or imagining scenarios that may never come to pass. There is the running commentary our minds provide on everything we encounter, a stream of judgments, comparisons, and reactions that never quite stops. Most insidious of all is the noise of hurry itself, the feeling that we must always be moving toward the next thing, consuming the next piece of information, making the next decision. We have confused motion with progress and mistake the feeling of being busy for the satisfaction of meaningful work. This noise doesn't just make us tired, it makes us shallow. When our attention is constantly divided, pulled in multiple directions by competing demands, we lose the ability to think beyond the surface of things. We develop what researchers call continuous partial attention, a state where we are aware of many things but truly focused on none. Consider what happens when you try to read something complex while your phone is nearby. Even when the phone is silent, even when you don't pick it up, your brain allocates a portion of its processing power to monitoring for potential interruptions. This leaves less mental capacity available for the demanding work of deep comprehension. You might get through the words, but you miss the meaning beneath them. The same thing happens with our thoughts. When we never give ourselves extended periods of uninterrupted mental space, our thinking remains reactive rather than reflective. We respond to whatever is immediately present instead of developing the kind of sustained attention that allows for genuine insight. The tragedy is that we often don't realize what we're losing. A mind that has adapted to noise begins to feel uncomfortable in quiet. We fill every moment, walking from one place to another, waiting in line, lying in bed before sleep, with input, podcasts, music, social media, internal chatter. We have forgotten that these transitional moments, these spaces between activities, are where some of our most important thinking happens. Ancient philosophers understood this. They spoke of the importance of leisure, not as mere relaxation, but as the mental state necessary for contemplation and wisdom. Aristotle argued that philosophy itself was only possible when people had freed themselves from the immediate pressures of survival and could engage in what he called pure thought. We don't need to become philosophers to benefit from this insight. Whether we're trying to solve a work problem, understand a relationship difficulty, or simply figure out what we really want from life, we need the same thing: uninterrupted time for our minds to work at their own pace, making connections we couldn't force, and arriving at insights we couldn't manufacture. But how do we create this space in a world designed to prevent it? The first step is recognizing that the noise is not neutral. Every interruption has a cost, not just in the moment it occurs, but in the way it trains our brains to expect and even crave distraction. Each time we reach for our phone during a quiet moment, we reinforce the pattern that equates silence with emptiness and stillness with waste. The second step is understanding that quiet is not the absence of something valuable. It's the presence of something essential. In the space between thoughts, in the pause between breaths, in the moment before we react, lies access to a kind of intelligence that noise cannot provide. This intelligence is patient rather than urgent, subtle rather than obvious, integrative rather than analytical. It's the intelligence that sees patterns across time, that synthesizes rather than just processes, that knows rather than just thinks. To reclaim this kind of thinking, we must become protective of quiet, the way we protect anything else we value. We must create boundaries around our attention and defend them with the same vigilance we would use to protect our homes from intruders. This is not selfishness, it's self-preservation. In a world that profits from our distraction, choosing to think deeply is a radical act. Chapter 2: The Crisis of Shallow Attention. Sarah sits at her desk, laptop open, trying to write an important email. Her phone buzzes with a text message. She glances at it, nothing urgent. But now she's lost her train of thought. She returns to the email, rereads what she's written, and starts again. 2 minutes later, a notification pops up on her computer. A colleague has shared a document. She clicks on it, telling herself she'll just take a quick look. 20 minutes later, she's deep in a rabbit hole of linked articles and has forgotten entirely about the email she was writing. This scene plays out millions of times each day, and we've become so accustomed to it that we barely notice the cost. But there is a cost, and it's profound. Every time our attention is interrupted and then redirected, we lose more than just time. We lose the thread of deep thinking that allows us to engage with complexity, to hold multiple ideas in relationship to each other, and to develop the kind of sustained focus that produces genuine insight. Neuroscientists have discovered that our brains are remarkably plastic. They adapt to whatever we ask them to do most often. When we constantly switch between tasks, our brains become optimized for task switching rather than sustained focus. We develop what researcher Adam Gazzaley calls interference, the inability to filter out irrelevant information and maintain attention on what matters most. This has consequences far beyond productivity. When we cannot sustain attention, we cannot engage in what psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls System 2 thinking, the slow, deliberate, effortful mental processing that allows us to reason through complex problems, consider multiple perspectives, and make thoughtful decisions. Instead, we default to System 1 thinking, fast, automatic, intuitive responses that are useful for simple decisions, but inadequate for complex ones. The result is that we find ourselves living increasingly on the surface of our own lives. We react rather than respond. We make decisions based on immediate emotions rather than considered reflection. We form opinions quickly and hold them lightly, swayed by whatever information we encountered most recently, rather than what we've thought through most carefully. This shallow thinking has infected not just our personal lives, but our collective discourse. Complex social and political issues are reduced to sound bites and slogans. Nuanced problems are met with simplistic solutions. We lose the ability to hold paradox, to sit with uncertainty, to consider that the truth might be more complicated than our initial reaction suggests. The pace of modern information flow makes this worse. We're exposed to more ideas in a single day than previous generations encountered in months. But exposure is not understanding. When information comes at us too quickly to process deeply, we develop what might be called intellectual indigestion, a state where we're consuming more than we can meaningfully metabolize. Social media platforms have weaponized this tendency, designing their interfaces to maximize what they call engagement, which really means keeping us in a state of continuous partial attention. The infinite scroll, the intermittent reinforcement of likes and comments, the algorithmic selection of content designed to provoke strong emotional reactions, all of these features are optimized to prevent the kind of sustained reflective attention that deep thinking requires. But the problem isn't just technological. We've also created cultural expectations that make deep thinking seem inefficient or even selfish. We admire people who can multitask and respond quickly to messages. We mistake being busy for being productive. We've internalized the belief that time spent thinking, really thinking without any visible output, is time wasted. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of our attention crisis. We've forgotten that thinking is not a luxury, but a necessity. Just as our bodies need time to process the food we eat, our minds need time to process the information we consume. Without this processing time, we become mentally malnourished, even in the midst of information abundance. The good news is that our brains retain their plasticity throughout our lives. Just as we can train ourselves to be distracted, we can train ourselves to focus. But this requires understanding that attention is not a finite resource that gets depleted. It's more like a muscle that grows stronger with use. The more we practice sustaining attention on a single object, the better we become at doing so. This doesn't mean we need to eliminate all sources of stimulation from our lives. It means we need to be more intentional about when we engage with them and when we step away. It means creating what researcher Cal Newport calls deep work sessions, extended periods where we can engage with cognitively demanding tasks without interruption. It means recognizing that our attention is one of our most valuable assets and protecting it accordingly. Most importantly, it means relearning to value the kind of thinking that can only happen when we slow down. The insights that come from sustained reflection, the creative solutions that emerge when we give problems time to percolate, the self-knowledge that develops when we spend time in our own company without distraction, these are not luxuries, but essentials for a meaningful life. The path back to deep thinking begins with a simple recognition. In a world designed to scatter our attention, choosing to focus is an act of rebellion. It's a declaration that we value depth over speed, quality over quantity, wisdom over information. It's a choice to reclaim our minds from the forces that would fragment them and to rediscover the profound satisfaction that comes from thinking well. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Deep Thought. There's a reason why the greatest thinkers in history, from Aristotle to Einstein, from Virginia Woolf to Maya Angelou, have all shared certain habits. They understood something about the conditions that allow deep thought to flourish, conditions that our modern world seems designed to prevent. Deep thinking is not just shallow thinking done more slowly. It's a qualitatively different kind of mental activity that requires what we might call a different architecture of attention. Where shallow thinking jumps quickly from topic to topic, making obvious connections and generating familiar responses, deep thinking moves more like water finding its way through rock, slowly, persistently, following the natural contours of a problem until it finds the hidden passages that lead to insight. This kind of thinking has several essential characteristics. First, it's sustained. Deep insights rarely come in the first few minutes of considering a problem. They emerge after we've sat with a question long enough for our minds to move beyond the obvious answers and begin exploring more subtle possibilities. This requires what T.S. Eliot called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. Second, deep thinking is integrative. Instead of analyzing components in isolation, it seeks to understand how different elements relate to each other and the larger whole. This is why many breakthrough insights involve seeing familiar things in new relationships, like Darwin recognizing the connection between Malthus's essay on population and his observations of natural selection, or Steve Jobs connecting calligraphy with computer design. Third, deep thinking is patient. It operates on what psychologist Jerome Bruner called incubation time, the period when our conscious minds need to step back and allow our unconscious processing to work on a problem. This is why solutions often come to us in the shower, on walks, or just before sleep. Our minds need downtime to make the unexpected connections that logic alone cannot produce. Finally, deep thinking is embodied. It's not just an abstract mental process, but something that involves our whole being, our emotions, our physical sensations, our intuitive responses. The deepest insights often come with what researcher Elkonon Goldberg calls an aha moment, a sudden sense of rightness that we feel as much as think. Understanding these characteristics helps us see why deep thinking has become so difficult in our current environment. The conditions that support sustained, integrative, patient, embodied reflection are exactly the conditions that modern life tends to disrupt. We're trained to seek quick answers rather than sit with questions. We're encouraged to break problems into manageable pieces rather than consider them holistically. We are rewarded for immediate responses rather than thoughtful reflection. We're taught to trust data and analysis over intuition and embodied wisdom. But we can deliberately create the conditions that support deeper thinking. This begins with what might be called cognitive hygiene, being as careful about what we allow into our mental space as we are about what we allow into our physical space. Just as we wouldn't expect to sleep well in a room filled with loud noises and bright lights, we can't expect to think deeply in an environment filled with distractions and interruptions. Creating cognitive space means establishing what researcher Sophie Leroy calls attention residue, the mental clearing that occurs when we fully complete one task before moving to another. It means having the discipline to close all unnecessary browser tabs, to silence notifications, to create physical and temporal boundaries around our thinking time. It also means learning to work with our natural rhythms rather than against them. Most people have certain times of day when their minds are naturally more focused and creative. For many, this is in the morning before the day's demands accumulate. For others, it might be late at night when the world has finally quieted. The key is to identify these periods and protect them fiercely. Physical environment matters too. Research shows that natural light, comfortable temperature, and the absence of visual clutter all support better thinking. Some people think best in complete silence. Others need gentle background sounds. Some prefer Spartan spaces. Others are inspired by beautiful surroundings. The important thing is to pay attention to what conditions help your mind settle into deeper states of reflection, and to create those conditions intentionally. Movement often plays a crucial role in deep thinking, and Nietzsche wrote at MAP, "All truly great thoughts are conceived while walking." Modern research supports this intuition, showing that gentle physical activity increases the production of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that supports neural growth and connectivity. Walking, in particular, seems to free the mind from its usual patterns and allow for more creative associations. But perhaps the most important element in the architecture of deep thought is time. Not just clock time, but psychological time. Deep thinking requires what researcher Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls flow, a state where we become so absorbed in what we're doing that we lose track of time entirely. This can't be scheduled or forced. It can only be invited by creating the right conditions and then allowing our minds to settle into their natural rhythm. This means learning to resist the urge to fill every moment with activity. It means being comfortable with what might look like doing nothing but is actually doing something essential, giving our minds space to process, connect, and create. It means understanding that the time spent staring out the window, walking without a destination, or sitting quietly with a problem is not time wasted, but time invested in the kind of thinking that makes us most human. The architecture of deep thought is not complicated, but it is counter-cultural. In a world that values speed over depth and productivity over contemplation, choosing to create conditions for sustained reflection requires courage. It requires us to trust that what emerges from quiet attention is worth more than what we produce in hurried activity. It requires us to value the invisible work of thinking as much as the visible work of doing. But for those willing to build this architecture in their lives, the rewards are profound. Deep thinking doesn't just help us solve problems more effectively, it changes our relationship to problems themselves. It helps us see challenges as opportunities for growth, rather than obstacles to overcome. It teaches us to appreciate complexity rather than fear it. Most importantly, it reconnects us to the deepest sources of creativity and wisdom that lie within us, waiting for the quiet space in which they can finally be heard. Chapter 4: Ancient Practices for Modern Minds. Long before neuroscience confirmed the benefits of contemplative practices, human beings discovered through experience the activities that cultivate deep thinking. These practices emerged independently across cultures and centuries, suggesting that they respond to something fundamental about how our minds work best. Walking meditation, practiced in Buddhist traditions for over 2 millennia, recognizes that gentle, rhythmic movement can serve as a bridge between the body and mind, creating the ideal conditions for reflection. When we walk slowly and deliberately, paying attention to each step, our analytical mind begins to quiet, and a more intuitive way of knowing emerges. The ancient Greeks elevated walking to an art form. Aristotle's school was called the Peripatetic school because he taught while walking with his students through the covered walkways of the Lyceum. They understood that movement helps ideas flow more freely, that the rhythm of walking somehow matches the rhythm of thought at its most natural pace. Modern research has validated this ancient wisdom. Studies show that walking increases creative output by an average of 60%. The key seems to be that walking provides just enough sensory input to prevent mind wandering while not requiring so much attention that it interferes with deeper processing. It's what researcher Mark Berman calls soft fascination, gentle engagement that restores rather than depletes our mental resources. But not all walking serves contemplation equally well. The most beneficial walking for thinking is done without destinations or deadlines, in places that are pleasant but not overstimulating. Natural environments work best because they provide what environmental psychologists call restorative experiences, exposure to settings that effortlessly capture our attention while allowing our directed attention to recover. This is why so many writers and thinkers have been devoted walkers. Charles Dickens walked 20 to 30 miles through London streets each night, working out the plot complications of his novels. Virginia Woolf walked for hours through the English countryside, later describing how her best ideas came during these solitary rambles. Maya Angelou would take long walks before sitting down to write, using the rhythm of walking to find the rhythm of her prose. The practice need not be elaborate. Even 10 minutes of slow, deliberate walking without any agenda can shift our mental state dramatically. The key is to walk for its own sake, not as transportation to somewhere else, and to allow our minds to wander where they will without trying to direct or control the process. Writing by hand represents another ancient practice that supports deep thinking. Before keyboards and screens, the physical act of forming letters on paper required a different kind of attention than we typically use today. This slower, more deliberate process naturally paces our thoughts, preventing the kind of mental rushing that leads to shallow thinking. Research shows that handwriting activates different neural pathways than typing, particularly in areas associated with memory and comprehension. When we write by hand, we're forced to be more selective about what we record, which requires us to process information more deeply before committing it to paper. This act of selection and synthesis is itself a form of thinking. Many great thinkers have been devoted to handwritten notes and journals. Leonardo da Vinci filled thousands of pages with his mirror script observations and reflections. Charles Darwin's notebooks reveal his mind at work, making connections between seemingly unrelated observations. Virginia Woolf's handwritten diaries show her working through both personal difficulties and artistic challenges with equal care and attention. The practice of keeping a handwritten journal or notebook isn't about producing anything for others to read. It's about creating a private space where thoughts can unfold naturally, where half-formed ideas can be captured and developed, where the connection between hand, mind, and heart can be strengthened through regular practice. Reading deeply, what scholar Sven Birkers calls deep reading, represents perhaps the most important contemplative practice for our time. Deep reading is different from the scanning and skimming that characterizes most of our interaction with text today. It involves sustained attention to a single piece of writing, allowing ourselves to be changed by the encounter with another mind. When we read deeply, we don't just extract information, we enter into a kind of mental partnership with the author. We slow down enough to notice not just what is being said, but how it's being said. We pause to consider implications, to connect ideas to our own experience, to question and wonder and sometimes disagree. This kind of reading is itself a form of thinking, active, engaged, transformative. The benefits of deep reading extend far beyond the particular knowledge we gain from any single book. Regular deep reading strengthens our capacity for sustained attention, improves our ability to hold complex ideas in mind simultaneously, and develops what literature professor Alan Jacobs calls the art of thinking long, the ability to consider questions over extended periods of time rather than demanding immediate answers. But deep reading requires defending against the forces that would fragment our attention. This means reading physical books when possible, because screens tend to encourage scanning rather than sustained attention. It means reading in quiet spaces without the possibility of digital interruption. It means choosing fewer books and engaging with them more thoroughly, rather than trying to consume as much content as possible. Most importantly, it means learning to read at the speed of understanding, rather than the speed of consumption. This might mean reading the same passage multiple times, or pausing to think about what we've read before continuing, or even stopping mid-book to let ideas percolate before returning to finish. Solitude, the practice of spending extended time alone without external stimulation, might be the most challenging contemplative practice for our hyper-connected age. We've become so accustomed to constant input that many people report feeling anxious or uncomfortable when left alone with their thoughts for even brief periods. But solitude is not isolation or loneliness. It's a chosen state of being alone with ourselves, without feeling the need to fill the space with activity or stimulation. In solitude, we can encounter what psychologist Anthony Storr calls the capacity to be alone, the ability to be comfortable in our own company and to find resources within ourselves, rather than always seeking them from external sources. Great thinkers throughout history have understood the necessity of solitude for deep thinking. Thoreau built his cabin at Walden Pond, not to escape society, but to discover what he could learn from his own company. Einstein took long sailing trips alone, using the time away from human interaction to work through complex problems. Georgia O'Keeffe spent months alone in the New Mexico desert, finding in solitude the space for her most profound artistic insights. The practice of solitude begins simply, spending small amounts of time alone without any agenda or entertainment. This might mean sitting quietly for 10 minutes each morning before starting the day, or taking a weekly walk alone in nature, or designating 1 hour each week for solitary reflection. The key is learning to be present with whatever arises in these quiet moments, thoughts, feelings, sensations, insights, without immediately reaching for distraction or stimulation. In this space of undirected attention, we often discover aspects of ourselves and our lives that were hidden beneath the noise of constant activity. These ancient practices, walking, writing by hand, deep reading, and solitude, are not relics of a simpler time, but proven methods for cultivating the kind of thinking our complex world most needs. They don't require special equipment or extensive training, but they do require something that has become precious in our age: the willingness to slow down and pay attention. In practicing them, we're not just improving our thinking, we're reclaiming our birthright as conscious beings capable of reflection, insight, and wisdom. We're choosing depth over surface, quality over quantity, being over doing. We're remembering that the most important thinking happens not when we're rushing toward answers, but when we're patient enough to live with questions until they ripen into understanding. Chapter 5. The Long View. In 1962, a young computer scientist named J.C.R. Licklider wrote a memo that would change the world. He envisioned what he called the Intergalactic Computer Network, a system that would connect computers around the globe and allow people to share information instantly. Most of his colleagues thought the idea was science fiction. It would be another 30 years before the World Wide Web made his vision a reality. Licklider was practicing what we might call long thinking, the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to possibilities that exist in potential, but not yet in actuality. This kind of thinking requires a fundamentally different relationship to time than what our culture typically promotes. Instead of focusing on quarterly results, daily metrics, or hourly updates, long thinking operates on the scale of years, decades, even generations. Long thinking is not just useful for visionaries and inventors. It's essential for anyone who wants to make decisions that create lasting value rather than just immediate satisfaction. Whether we're choosing a career, building relationships, or trying to solve complex problems, the ability to think beyond immediate consequences often determines whether our actions ultimately help or harm. But long thinking has become increasingly difficult in a world that rewards speed and punishes patience. We're surrounded by systems designed to capture our attention in the moment, news cycles that change daily, social media feeds that refresh constantly, business environments that demand immediate responses to emails and messages. These systems train us to think reactively, responding to whatever is most recent, most urgent, or most emotionally provocative. The cost of this reactive thinking extends far beyond poor decisions. When we're always responding to immediate stimuli, we lose touch with our deeper values and longer-term goals. We become what researcher Sherry Turkle calls tethered selves, people who exist primarily in relation to whatever is demanding our attention at the moment, rather than from any internal center of purpose or direction. Reactive thinking also makes us vulnerable to what behavioral economists call present bias, the tendency to overweight immediate rewards and underweight future consequences. This bias explains why people struggle with everything from personal finances to climate change. The immediate costs of changing our behavior are vivid and concrete, while the future benefits remain abstract and uncertain. Long thinking requires developing what philosopher Derek Parfit called temporal impartiality, the ability to give equal weight to our future selves and our present selves when making decisions. This is harder than it sounds, because our future selves can feel like strangers to us. Research shows that when people look at brain scans of their future selves, the neural activity is more similar to looking at strangers than to looking at their current selves. But we can train ourselves to think more expansively about time. One powerful practice is what researchers call prospective hindsight. Imagining ourselves at some point in the future looking back on current decisions. When we think about how we'll feel about a choice in 10 years, we often make different decisions than we would based on how we feel about it today. Another practice is developing what Aldo Leopold called thinking like a mountain, considering the long-term consequences of our actions on the larger systems of which we are part. Leopold realized that killing predators to protect deer populations actually harmed the ecosystem by allowing deer to overgraze vegetation. What seemed beneficial in the short term proved destructive over time. This kind of systems thinking is essential for long thinking. Instead of focusing on individual components in isolation, it seeks to understand how different elements interact over time. It recognizes that complex systems often behave counterintuitively, that the obvious solution to a problem sometimes makes the problem worse, while the effective solution might seem unrelated or even contrary to common sense. Long thinking also requires what psychologist Angela Duckworth calls grit, the ability to persist in pursuit of long-term goals despite setbacks, boredom, and the temptation to pursue more immediately rewarding activities. This is different from simple willpower or self-control. It's more like what marathoners call settling in, finding a sustainable pace that allows for persistence over time. But grit alone is not enough. Long thinking also requires what researchers call strategic patience, the wisdom to know when to persist and when to pivot, when to hold steady and when to adapt. This kind of discernment comes from what the Stoic philosophers called the view from above, the ability to step back from immediate circumstances and see patterns that are invisible from ground level. One of the most powerful tools for developing long thinking is what futurist Stuart Brand calls the long now, deliberately extending our time horizon to encompass not just our own lives, but the lives of our children and grandchildren. Brand co-founded a project to build a clock designed to run for 10,000 years, not because the world needs another clock, but because building it forces people to think about problems on a completely different timescale. When we think in terms of decades or centuries, rather than days or months, different kinds of solutions become apparent. Problems that seem intractable on short timescales often have elegant solutions when we zoom out. Challenges that seem urgent and overwhelming when viewed through the lens of immediate needs often prove to be temporary fluctuations when viewed from a longer perspective. This doesn't mean ignoring immediate needs or failing to respond to genuine emergencies. It means developing the ability to distinguish between what's truly urgent and what just feels urgent, between what requires immediate action and what benefits from patient consideration. Long thinking also recognizes that the most important changes often happen slowly and imperceptibly. Social movements that seem to emerge overnight usually build for years or decades before reaching critical mass. Scientific breakthroughs that appear sudden typically represent the culmination of accumulated insights from many researchers over long periods. Personal transformations that seem dramatic often result from small, consistent changes maintained over time. This understanding can be deeply reassuring in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. When we develop the capacity for long thinking, we become less reactive to daily fluctuations and more attuned to underlying trends and patterns. We become better at distinguishing signal from noise, at seeing the forest as well as the trees. Perhaps most importantly, long thinking connects us to something larger than our immediate concerns. It helps us understand that we're part of an ongoing story that began before us and will continue after us. This perspective can be both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminds us that our individual problems are part of larger patterns. Empowering because it suggests that our actions, however small, contribute to outcomes that extend far beyond our immediate circumstances. In a world that seems increasingly short-sighted and reactive, the capacity for long thinking might be one of the most valuable skills we can develop. It allows us to be more intentional about the legacy we leave, more thoughtful about the consequences of our choices, and more connected to the deeper currents that shape human experience across time. The practice of long thinking begins with simple questions. How will I feel about this decision in 10 years? What patterns am I reinforcing with my choices? What would I do differently if I were optimizing for my great-grandchildren's well-being rather than my immediate comfort? These questions don't always provide easy answers, but they consistently lead to wiser ones. Chapter 6. The Art of Silent Decision-Making. The most important decision of Maria's career came to her, not in a boardroom or during a heated discussion, but while she was sitting quietly in her garden at dawn, watching the first light touch the leaves of her grandmother's rosebush. She had been wrestling for months with whether to leave her successful law practice to start a non-profit focused on environmental justice. The logical arguments seemed evenly balanced. Good reasons to stay, good reasons to go. But in that quiet moment, something deeper than logic provided the answer. We live in a culture that approaches decision-making as if it were purely a rational process, gathering information, weighing pros and cons, calculating costs and benefits. While these analytical tools have their place, they miss something essential about how our wisest choices actually emerge. Many of our most important decisions come not from thinking harder, but from learning to listen to the intelligence that speaks only in silence. This is not mysticism or anti-intellectualism. It's recognition that human beings possess multiple ways of knowing, and that some of the most sophisticated processing our minds do happens below the threshold of conscious awareness. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio discovered that patients with damage to the emotional centers of their brains, while retaining their analytical abilities, became incapable of making good decisions. They could process information normally, but they had lost access to what he calls somatic markers, the subtle bodily sensations that guide us toward beneficial choices and away from harmful ones. These somatic markers represent a form of embodied wisdom that has been refined over millions of years of evolution. They integrate vast amounts of information, memories, patterns, subtle environmental cues, in ways that our conscious minds cannot match for speed or sophistication. But accessing this wisdom requires creating the conditions where it can be heard, and the primary condition is silence. Silence in decision-making doesn't mean the absence of information or consultation with others. It means creating space between the gathering of information and the making of choice, allowing what we might call decision time for deeper processing to occur. This is why sleeping on important decisions often leads to different conclusions than those we reach through immediate analysis. The unconscious mind continues working on problems even when the conscious mind has moved on to other things. Traditional cultures understood this and built waiting periods into important decisions. Many Native American tribes required that major choices affecting the community be considered for 7 generations into the future, a process that naturally involved extended reflection rather than immediate action. The Quaker tradition of sitting with difficult questions until way opens recognizes that the best solutions often emerge from patient attention rather than forced analysis. But learning to make decisions in silence requires overcoming some deeply ingrained habits. We're trained to believe that good decisions require extensive research, multiple options, and detailed analysis. While these can be valuable, they can also become forms of procrastination, ways of avoiding the ultimately irreducible uncertainty that accompanies any meaningful choice. The practice of silent decision-making begins with learning to distinguish between decisions that require extensive analysis and those that benefit from quieter forms of attention. Complicated decisions, those involving many variables, but clear criteria for evaluation, usually benefit from systematic analysis. Complex decisions, those involving uncertainty, competing values, or long-term consequences that are difficult to predict, often benefit more from what we might call contemplative decision-making. Contemplative decision-making starts with a different question than analytical decision-making. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" it asks, "What is trying to emerge?" This subtle shift moves us from a stance of forcing solutions to one of listening for what wants to happen. It recognizes that sometimes the best decisions come not from imposing our will, but from aligning ourselves with deeper currents of possibility and purpose. This approach requires developing what might be called decision sensitivity, the ability to notice when a choice feels right or wrong at a level deeper than rational analysis. Some decisions, when we contemplate them quietly, create a sense of expansion, energy, and alignment. Others, regardless of their logical merits, create contraction, depletion, or discord. Learning to recognize these subtle signals takes practice, but they often prove more reliable guides than extensive analysis. The practice involves several steps. First, after gathering necessary information, but before making a choice, create space for silence. This might mean taking a walk, sitting in meditation, or simply pausing for several minutes in a quiet place. The key is to step away from active problem solving and allow the mind to settle. Second, bring the decision to mind not as a problem to be solved, but as a question to be lived with. Hold the different options lightly without grasping after immediate answers. Notice what arises: thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, images, memories. Don't judge or analyze these responses. Simply observe them with curiosity. Third, pay attention to subtle shifts in energy or mood as you contemplate different possibilities. Some choices will feel heavy or draining even if they seem logical. Others will feel enlivening even if they involve uncertainty or risk. These energetic responses often provide valuable information about alignment with deeper values and purposes. Finally, allow solutions to emerge rather than forcing them. Sometimes the right choice becomes obvious during this process of quiet contemplation. Other times, what emerges is not a specific decision, but a clearer sense of what questions to ask or what additional information might be helpful. This approach works particularly well for what researcher Barry Schwartz calls maximizer decisions, choices where we're trying to find the best possible option rather than simply a good enough one. Maximizer decisions often create anxiety because they involve perfectionist thinking and fear of making the wrong choice. Contemplative decision-making can help by reconnecting us to what we actually value, rather than what we think we should value. One of the most powerful aspects of silent decision-making is that it often reveals options we hadn't previously considered. When we're locked into analytical thinking, we tend to see choices as binary, either or propositions. But quiet contemplation sometimes reveals third alternatives that transcend the original dilemma. The solution might involve reframing the problem entirely, changing the timeline for decision-making, or recognizing that what seemed like one decision is actually several smaller decisions that can be made separately. Silent decision-making also helps with what psychologists call decision fatigue, the deterioration in decision quality that occurs when we've made too many choices in a short period. By learning to make some decisions more intuitively, we preserve cognitive resources for choices that truly require extensive analysis. But perhaps the most valuable aspect of this approach is that it helps us make decisions that are authentically our own. When we are constantly consuming input from others, advice, opinions, research, social media, we can lose touch with our own inner compass. Silent decision-making creates space to hear our own voice amid all the external noise. This doesn't mean ignoring wise counsel or refusing to consider different perspectives. It means developing the capacity to take in information without being overwhelmed by it, to consider advice without automatically deferring to it, to remain open to influence while staying connected to our own deepest knowing. The practice becomes particularly important for life's major transitions, career changes, relationship decisions, questions about where to live or how to spend our time. These choices often can't be optimized through analysis alone because they involve values, identity, and vision for the future that are inherently subjective. What matters most in these decisions is not finding the objectively correct answer, but finding the answer that's right for us at this particular moment in our evolution. Learning to make decisions in silence is ultimately about learning to trust ourselves. not our surface preferences or immediate reactions, but the deeper intelligence that emerges when we create space for wisdom to arise. It's about recognizing that we often know more than we think we know, and that this knowledge becomes accessible when we stop trying so hard to figure everything out and start learning to listen. In a world that profits from our confusion and indecision, learning to access our own inner guidance is a radical act. It's a declaration that we possess the resources to navigate our lives wisely, that we don't need to outsource our most important choices to experts or algorithms or the opinions of others. It's a return to the ancient understanding that within each of us lies a source of wisdom that, when given proper conditions, naturally flows toward choices that serve not just our immediate interests, but our deepest flourishing. Chapter 7. The Gifts That Come Only from Quiet. There are discoveries that cannot be forced, insights that resist effort, and forms of knowledge that emerge only when we stop trying to acquire them. These gifts come to us not through the intensity of focused seeking, but through the receptivity of patient waiting. They represent perhaps the deepest paradox of human consciousness, that sometimes the most important things come to us only when we cease striving for them. Scientists have long recognized this phenomenon in their own work. The structure of benzene came to chemist Auguste Kekulé in a dream of a snake seizing its own tail. The theory of relativity emerged for Einstein not during his focused calculations, but during what he called combinatory play with ideas and images. Mathematician Henri Poincaré discovered the key to Fuchsian functions while stepping onto a bus, his mind completely occupied with other matters. These moments of sudden understanding share certain characteristics. They typically occur during states of relaxed attention rather than intense concentration. They often involve sudden reorganization of existing knowledge rather than the acquisition of new information. And they frequently come with what researcher John Cunios calls an aha experience, a sudden sense of certainty that feels qualitatively different from the gradual construction of logical arguments. Neuroscientists studying creativity have discovered that these eureka moments involve a different pattern of brain activity than analytical problem-solving. Instead of the focused attention that characterizes logical analysis, insight involves what researcher Mark Beeman calls diffuse attention, a state where multiple brain regions work together in ways that allow for unexpected connections between previously unrelated ideas. This diffuse attention state is closely related to what researchers call the default mode network, a collection of brain regions that become active when we're not focused on specific tasks. This network, which includes areas involved in self-referential thinking, memory consolidation, and envisioning future scenarios, appears to be crucial for the kind of integrative processing that leads to creative insights. But accessing these states requires something that has become increasingly rare in our hyper-connected world: unstructured time. The default mode network is most active when we're engaged in simple, repetitive activities that don't require focused attention: walking, showering, doing routine tasks, or simply sitting quietly. These activities provide what researcher Jerome Singer called positive, constructive daydreaming, a state of mind that allows for creative association and insight. The gifts that come from quiet are not limited to dramatic moments of scientific discovery. They include the subtle forms of knowing that help us navigate daily life with greater wisdom and grace. There's the sudden clarity about a relationship that comes during a quiet morning walk, the solution to a work problem that emerges while washing dishes, the sense of direction that arises during a few minutes of silent reflection. These moments of clarity often involve what psychologist Eugene Gendlin called felt sense, a bodily awareness of the rightness or wrongness of different possibilities. Unlike analytical thinking, which processes information sequentially and explicitly, felt sense integrates vast amounts of information holistically and often unconsciously. It's the gut feeling that tells us when something's off about a situation, even when we can't articulate exactly what's wrong. Learning to recognize and trust felt sense requires developing what we might call somatic intelligence, the ability to pay attention to the subtle sensations and energetic shifts that accompany different thoughts, decisions, and interactions. This kind of intelligence has been systematically ignored by a culture that privileges rational analysis over embodied wisdom, but it represents one of our most sophisticated forms of information processing. Quiet also provides access to what spiritual traditions have long called wisdom, a form of understanding that goes beyond mere knowledge to encompass insight into the nature of existence itself. This wisdom often involves recognizing patterns that connect seemingly disparate phenomena, seeing through surface appearances to underlying realities, and understanding the interdependence of all things. Such wisdom cannot be acquired through effort alone. It emerges naturally when the mind is sufficiently quiet to perceive subtleties that are usually obscured by mental activity. It's like trying to see the bottom of a pond. The clarity comes not from stirring the water more vigorously, but from allowing the sediment to settle until the water becomes clear. This settling requires what contemplative traditions call non-doing, a state of alert receptivity that is neither passive nor active, but something altogether different. It's the state of the artist who allows the painting to paint itself, the writer who lets the words flow through, rather than forcing them onto the page, the problem solver who creates space for solutions to emerge rather than wrestling them into existence. Non-doing is particularly important for what we might call life questions, those fundamental issues of meaning, purpose, and direction that can't be resolved through analysis alone. Questions like, what is my purpose? Or how should I spend my remaining years? Or what really matters? Require a different kind of attention than practical problems. They need to be lived with rather than solved, contemplated rather than calculated. The answers to these questions, when they come, often arrive not as logical conclusions, but as shifts in perception or understanding. We might suddenly see our life situation from a completely different angle, recognize patterns we hadn't noticed before, or feel a sense of rightness about a direction that previously seemed unclear. These shifts can be subtle, a gradual clarification of values or priorities, or dramatic, a complete reorientation of how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. But perhaps the most profound gift that comes from quiet is what we might call presence, the ability to be fully here in this moment, without the mental commentary that usually accompanies our experience. In presence, we encounter life directly rather than through the filter of our thoughts about life. We taste food rather than thinking about taste, feel the warmth of sunlight rather than noting that it's warm, hear music rather than analyzing its structure. This direct encounter with immediate experience often reveals dimensions of reality that are invisible to the thinking mind. Colors seem more vivid, sensations more nuanced, connections more apparent. Time shifts from a linear progression of moments to a spacious now that contains infinite depth. We remember what it means to be fully alive rather than just thinking about living. These experiences of presence are not exotic or mystical, though they can feel profound. They are available to anyone willing to step out of mental activity long enough to notice what's actually happening in the present moment. They represent our natural state, when the mind is not cluttered with preoccupations, plans, and commentary. The cultivation of presence begins with simple practices, spending a few minutes each day just breathing without agenda, eating a meal in silence while paying attention to taste and texture, walking slowly while noticing the feeling of feet touching the ground. These practices might seem insignificant, but they represent a radical shift from our usual mode of being, from doing to being, from thinking about life to experiencing it directly. Over time, these moments of presence begin to inform our daily lives in subtle but important ways. We become more responsive and less reactive. We notice things we previously missed. We find ourselves more connected to others and to our environment. We develop what researcher Ellen Langer calls mindful awareness, the ability to notice new things and be open to different possibilities. The gifts that come from quiet are not consolation prizes for those unable to succeed in the busy world of constant activity. They represent forms of intelligence and wisdom that are essential for navigating the complexity and uncertainty of human existence. In a world that seems increasingly chaotic and fragmented, the ability to access these deeper resources may be one of our most valuable capacities. But receiving these gifts requires a fundamental shift in how we relate to productivity and achievement. It requires valuing being as much as doing, receptivity as much as activity, waiting as much as seeking. It requires trusting that the time spent in quiet contemplation is not time stolen from more important activities, but time invested in the source from which all meaningful activity flows. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that we are not just biological machines designed to process information and produce outputs. We are conscious beings capable of wisdom, insight, and direct knowing, capacities that flourish not in the noise of constant stimulation, but in the fertile silence of sustained attention. In reclaiming quiet, we reclaim access to the deepest gifts of human consciousness itself. Chapter 8. Living the Quiet Life. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. After years of living at the pace of constant stimulation and divided attention, the shift toward a quieter way of being unfolds gradually, like a photograph slowly developing in solution. At first, the changes are subtle, a moment of unexpected clarity during a morning walk, a solution that emerges while washing dishes, a sense of peace that arrives during a few minutes of silence before sleep. But over time, these moments begin to accumulate and connect. The mind that has learned to settle into quiet starts to carry some of that stillness into daily activities. The person who has discovered the gifts that come from patient attention begins to approach all of life with greater receptivity and less rushing. What begins as a practice gradually becomes a way of being. This doesn't mean withdrawing from the world or abandoning engagement with the demands of modern life. The quiet life is not about becoming a hermit or rejecting technology and social connection. It's about finding a different relationship to these things, one that allows us to engage fully without being overwhelmed, to participate actively without losing ourselves in the process. Living quietly in a noisy world requires what we might call conscious boundaries, the deliberate creation of conditions that protect our capacity for deep attention and reflection. These boundaries are not walls that separate us from life, but more like the banks of a river that allow the water to flow with greater depth and power. Physical boundaries might include creating spaces in our homes and that are designated for quiet activities, reading, writing, reflection, and keeping these spaces free from digital devices and other sources of stimulation. They might involve establishing certain times of day as quiet hours, when we refrain from consuming information or engaging in stimulating activities. Temporal boundaries involve being more intentional about how we structure our days and weeks. This might mean starting each morning with a period of silence before checking messages or news. It might involve taking regular walks without headphones or podcasts, allowing our minds to wander and settle. It might mean ending each day with a few minutes of reflection rather than falling asleep to the glow of screens. Digital boundaries are particularly important in our current environment. This doesn't necessarily mean eliminating technology from our lives, but it does mean being more conscious about when and how we engage with it. We might designate certain hours as offline time or create physical spaces that remain free from digital devices. We might practice what researcher Cal Newport calls digital minimalism, using technology intentionally to support our values rather than allowing it to shape our attention and priorities. But perhaps the most important boundaries are internal ones, the development of what we might call mental sovereignty. This means learning to choose what we pay attention to, rather than allowing our attention to be captured by whatever is loudest or most immediate. It means developing the capacity to pause between stimulus and response, creating space for wisdom to inform our choices. Mental sovereignty requires recognizing that attention is one of our most valuable resources and protecting it accordingly. Just as we wouldn't allow strangers to walk into our homes and rearrange our furniture, we need to be selective about what we allow into our mental space. This means being more conscious about the information we consume, the conversations we engage in, and the mental habits we cultivate. It also means learning to distinguish between what truly requires our immediate attention and what simply feels urgent. Much of what presents itself as urgent is actually just persistent. Problems that won't be solved by immediate action, but that benefit from sustained, thoughtful attention over time. Living the quiet life also involves rethinking our relationship to productivity and achievement. In a culture that equates busyness with importance and activity with value, choosing to slow down can feel like falling behind. But this perception reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how meaningful work actually happens. The most important work, whether it's raising children, creating art, building relationships, or solving complex problems, rarely happens at the pace of immediate response and constant activity. It happens through sustained attention over time, through the patient accumulation of insight and understanding, through the slow development of skills and wisdom that can't be rushed. This means learning to value what researcher Gay Hendricks calls zone of genius activities, work that emerges from our deepest talents and passions, rather than just our competencies and duties. These activities often require the kind of sustained, undivided attention that becomes impossible when we're constantly responding to external demands. Living quietly also means developing a different relationship to uncertainty and not knowing. In a world that promises instant answers and immediate solutions, learning to be comfortable with questions that don't have easy answers becomes a crucial skill. Some of life's most important questions about meaning, purpose, love, and loss can't be resolved through research or analysis, but must be lived with over time. This capacity to live with uncertainty is closely related to what poet John Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in doubt and uncertainty without irritably reaching after fact and reason. It's the recognition that some forms of understanding can't be forced, but must be allowed to emerge in their own time. The quiet life is not a passive life. Those who learn to access the intelligence that emerges from stillness often find themselves more effective in their activities, not less. They make decisions with greater clarity, solve problems more creatively, and relate to others with greater presence and empathy. They discover that slowing down doesn't mean falling behind, but rather moving at the pace of depth and sustainability. But perhaps most importantly, living the quiet life means remembering what it feels like to be truly alive. In the silence between thoughts, in the space between breaths, in the pause between activities, we encounter something that all the noise and busyness in the world cannot provide. The simple, profound experience of being conscious, of being here, of being ourselves without apology or explanation. This remembering is not a luxury, but a necessity. In a world that seems increasingly fragmented and chaotic, the people who can access inner stillness and clarity become sources of stability and wisdom for others. They offer what poet William Stafford called a quality of attention that helps others remember their own capacity for depth and presence. The quiet life is ultimately an act of service to ourselves, to those we love, and to the world that desperately needs the kind of wisdom that can only emerge from sustained, patient attention. It's a choice to value depth over surface, quality over quantity, being over doing. It's a declaration that we are more than biological machines designed to process information and produce outputs. We are conscious beings capable of wonder, wisdom, and profound connection, capacities that flourish not in the noise of constant stimulation, but in the fertile silence of sustained attention. In choosing to live more quietly, we don't withdraw from life, but enter more fully into it. We discover that the peace we seek is not somewhere else, waiting to be found, but here in this moment, available whenever we have the courage to stop running and the wisdom to be still. The invitation is simple but not easy, to reclaim quiet in a world that profits from our distraction, to choose depth in a culture that rewards speed, to trust that what emerges from stillness is worth more than what we produce in haste. It's an invitation to remember who we are beneath all the noise and rushing, and to live from that deeper place of knowing and peace. In the end, thinking in quiet is not just about improving our cognitive abilities or making better decisions, though it does both of these things. It's about reclaiming our birthright as conscious beings and rediscovering the profound satisfaction that comes from living at the pace of wisdom rather than the pace of fear. It's about choosing to be fully present in our own lives and trusting that this presence is in itself a gift to the world.